The carriage door slammed shut, and Duke Edmund Ashworth did not even glance at the woman he had just left standing alone on the church steps. Behind him, whispers rippled through the small crowd gathered outside the chapel. Another lady rejected. Another family humiliated. It was the 5th time this year, and London had stopped counting with sympathy and started counting with amusement. Edmund leaned back against the leather seat as the wheels rattled over the cobblestones, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on nothing. He was not cruel by nature, though the papers liked to paint him that way. He simply could not bear another evening of practiced laughter and rehearsed compliments. Another young woman, coached by her mother to agree with everything he said. He had sat through 20 minutes of Miss Caroline Ashford praising his estate, his horses, his title, and not once had she asked him a single question about himself. He was tired of being a prize to be won, rather than a man to be known. At Ashworth Hall, his grandmother waited in the drawing room, with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. Duchess Margaret Ashworth was 71 years old and had buried a husband, a son, and a daughter-in-law. Yet her spine remained as straight as the day she first entered society. She heard the carriage arrive and set down her cup with a soft, deliberate click. Edmund entered the room already bracing for a lecture. "I assume it did not go well," she said, not looking up from her needlework. "It went exactly as I expected," Edmund replied. "She spent the entire dinner listing my accomplishments back to me as though I did not already know them." "And did you give her a chance to speak of anything else?" Edmund did not answer. His grandmother finally looked up, studying him the way she had studied him since he was a boy of 12, newly orphaned and refusing to cry in front of the household staff. She had watched him build walls around himself brick by brick, year by year, until even she sometimes struggled to find the boy underneath the title. "You cannot keep doing this, Edmund," she said gently. "You reject every woman before you allow her the chance to be anything more than a name on a list. One day you will look up and find yourself old and alone in this house, with no one left who remembers your laugh." "I laugh plenty," Edmund said, though even he did not believe it. His grandmother rose slowly, crossed the room, and placed a hand on his arm. "Then let an old woman meddle, just once more. Not with a lady of the ton this time, someone different." Edmund sighed, already regretting that he had not left the room sooner. "Grandmother. Just once more," she repeated, and there was something in her voice, a quiet steel, that made him stop arguing. Miles away, in a modest cottage on the edge of the village of Thornbury, Eleanor Whitfield knelt beside the hearth, coaxing a stubborn fire back to life. Her aunt, Beatrice Whitfield, sat wrapped in a woolen shawl nearby, her joints aching in the cold morning air. "You needn't fuss over me so," Aunt Beatrice said, though her tired smile suggested otherwise. "Go and rest, dear. You have been on your feet since dawn." "I don't mind," Eleanor said, adding another log to the flames. "Besides, if I rest, you will only try to fetch the water yourself, and then I shall have 2 invalids to care for instead of 1. Aunt Beatrice chuckled, a dry, warm sound. "Impertinent girl." "Practical girl," Eleanor corrected, rising and brushing soot from her hands. At 23 she carried herself with a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with fine dresses or jewels, for she owned very few of either. Her father had once been a respected merchant, but poor investments and an unfortunate illness had stripped the family of most of its fortune before his death 3 years earlier. Since then, Eleanor had devoted herself to caring for her aunt, taking in mending work, and reading every book she could borrow from the vicar's modest library. She was not bitter about her circumstances, though she had every reason to be. She had simply decided, somewhere in the quiet months after her father's death, that dignity did not require wealth, and happiness did not require a title. It was later that same week, on a gray Sunday morning, that Duchess Margaret Ashworth found herself at the small chapel in Thornbury, having stopped there on her way back from visiting an old friend. Her carriage wheel had cracked, and she was forced to wait while it was repaired, so she wandered into the chapel to pass the time. She noticed Eleanor immediately, not because the young woman was dressed finely, for she was not, but because of the way she moved through the small crowd after the service. She stopped to help an elderly man who had dropped his cane. She listened, truly listened, to a widow who wanted to speak of her late husband, even though others had already begun drifting away. There was no performance in it, no awareness of being watched. Eleanor simply behaved as though every person before her mattered. The Duchess approached her as the crowd thinned. "You have a kind way about you," the Duchess said. Eleanor turned, startled by the elegant older woman addressing her directly. "Thank you, ma'am. I only did what anyone would do." "You would be surprised how few do it," the Duchess replied, studying her closely. "What is your name, child?" "Eleanor Whitfield, ma'am." And you live here in Thornbury? Yes, with my aunt. She is unwell, so I care for her. The Duchess asked a few more questions, about her family, her father's former trade, her days spent reading and mending. Eleanor answered honestly, without embellishment, without trying to appear more impressive than she was. There was no flattery in her voice, no eagerness to please. She spoke to the Duchess exactly as she had spoken to the widow moments before. By the time the carriage wheel was repaired, Duchess Margaret Ashworth had made up her mind about something, though she said nothing of it to Eleanor. She simply thanked her for the pleasant conversation and climbed back into her carriage, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corner of her mouth. That evening, back at Ashworth Hall, she sat across from her grandson at dinner, watching him push food around his plate without appetite. "I have found her," the Duchess said simply. Edmund looked up, wary. "Found whom?" "The woman I intend for you to meet. Properly this time. No games, no schemes disguised as chance encounters. Just an introduction." "Grandmother, I told you. You told me you would allow me one more attempt," she said firmly. "I intend to hold you to it." Edmund set down his fork, exhaling slowly. He had learned long ago that arguing with his grandmother, once she had decided something, was as useful as arguing with the tide. And perhaps, some small part of him admitted, he was curious despite himself. She had never spoken of anyone with quite that look in her eye before. "Very well," he said at last. "One more attempt. But I make no promises." "I never asked for promises," the Duchess said, lifting her teacup with quiet triumph. "Only patience." Edmund did not sleep well that night. He told himself it was nothing more than dread at the thought of another dinner, another list of compliments recited like scripture. But some restless part of him, buried beneath years of guarded silence, wondered who this woman could be that had so thoroughly captured his grandmother's attention. He did not yet know her name. He did not know that she lived in a modest cottage with cracked window panes and a fire that needed constant tending. He did not know that she had spent the afternoon mending a torn dress by candlelight, humming softly to herself, entirely unaware that a duke lay awake in a grand house several miles away, thinking of a woman he had never met. But he would know soon enough, and nothing in his carefully guarded life would be the same again. The next morning, Eleanor rose before the sun, as she always did, to light the fire and prepare a simple breakfast before her aunt woke. The cottage was small, with only 2 rooms besides the kitchen, but Eleanor had learned to make it feel warm, despite its modest walls. She had hung a faded curtain over the cracked window to keep out the draft, and she kept fresh herbs drying above the hearth, filling the small space with the scent of rosemary and thyme. As she worked, she thought briefly of the elegant woman she had spoken with outside the chapel. There had been something remarkable about her, a sharpness in her gaze that suggested she missed very little, and a warmth beneath it that surprised Eleanor. Most fine ladies who passed through Thornbury barely acknowledged the villagers, let alone stopped to speak with them at length. But Eleanor did not dwell on the encounter for long. She had mending to finish, a fire to keep burning, and her aunt's medicine to collect from the apothecary before noon. She walked the mile into the village with her basket over her arm, greeting neighbors along the way. The blacksmith's wife asked after Aunt Beatrice's health. The baker's son offered her a slightly burnt loaf at half price, which she gratefully accepted. Life in Thornbury moved slowly and predictably, and Eleanor had come to find comfort in that rhythm, even if some quiet part of her occasionally wondered what lay beyond the hills that surrounded the village. She had once dreamed of more. As a girl, she had imagined traveling to London, attending grand balls, perhaps even falling in love with someone who saw past her modest circumstances. But those dreams had faded quietly after her father's death, replaced by the steady, unglamorous work of survival. She did not resent this. She had simply learned that dreams, however lovely, could not fill an empty larder or pay for a physician's visit. Back at Ashworth Hall, Duchess Margaret spent the following days quietly arranging what she hoped would appear to be an entirely natural introduction. She knew her grandson well enough to understand that if he suspected any scheme, he would refuse outright, retreating further behind the walls he had built since childhood. So she moved carefully, mentioning to a mutual acquaintance that she wished to visit an elderly woman in Thornbury who had once been a dear friend of her late husband's family, and that she required an escort familiar with the village. It was a small lie, but a necessary one. The Duchess had learned long ago that sometimes love required a gentle push in the right direction, especially for a man as stubborn as her grandson had become. Edmund, for his part, spent those same days attending to estate matters he had long neglected, reviewing ledgers and meeting with his steward about the coming harvest. It was easier to bury himself in numbers and reports than to think about the strange restlessness that had settled over him since his grandmother's announcement. He told himself it was simply irritation at being managed once again, but late at night, when the house grew quiet and his thoughts wandered freely, he found himself wondering about the woman his grandmother had so carefully avoided naming. He did not yet know that her hands were often chapped from cold water and honest work. He did not know that she laughed easily despite her hardships, or that she read poetry aloud to her aunt in the evenings to keep the old woman's spirits high. He knew nothing of Eleanor Whitfield at all. But fate, guided gently by a determined old woman who refused to watch her grandson grow old alone, was already drawing them together, one quiet step at a time. The knock at the cottage door came sooner than Eleanor expected, and it startled her so badly that she nearly dropped the teapot she had been drying. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find a liveried footman standing on the step, a folded letter in his gloved hand. "For Miss Whitfield," he said, bowing slightly before turning to leave without further explanation. Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers, half expecting bad news. Instead, she found an invitation, written in elegant, looping script, requesting the pleasure of her company at Ashworth Hall for afternoon tea, on behalf of Duchess Margaret Ashworth. The letter explained, briefly, that the Duchess had enjoyed their conversation outside the chapel and wished to continue it in more comfortable surroundings. Aunt Beatrice, when told the news, nearly dropped her knitting. The Ashworth family? Eleanor, that is one of the oldest and wealthiest houses in the county. Why on earth would the Duchess take an interest in us? I have no idea, Eleanor admitted, staring at the letter as though it might rearrange itself into something more sensible. Perhaps she was simply being kind. Kindness does not usually come with an engraved invitation and a footman in silk stockings, Aunt Beatrice said, though her eyes twinkled with curiosity rather than suspicion. You must go, of course. It would be unthinkable to refuse a duchess. Eleanor spent the following 2 days in quiet anxiety, torn between excitement and dread. She had only one dress suitable for such an occasion, a pale blue gown that had belonged to her mother, carefully preserved and altered to fit her slimmer frame. She pressed it herself, mended a small tear along the hem, and polished her only pair of decent shoes until they gleamed as best they could. On the appointed day, a carriage arrived to collect her, far grander than anything she had ever ridden in. She sat stiffly on the velvet seat as the countryside rolled past the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never been inside a house like Ashworth Hall, had only glimpsed its towers and gardens from a distance during walks through the countryside. Now she was being delivered directly to its front steps. The hall itself was even more overwhelming up close, with soaring ceilings, gilded frames, and a staircase wide enough to fit an entire cottage within its curve. A butler named Godfrey led her through a maze of corridors, to a bright drawing room, where Duchess Margaret sat waiting, a tea service already arranged on the table before her. "Miss Whitfield," the Duchess said warmly, rising to greet her. "I am so pleased you came." "Thank you for the invitation, Your Grace," Eleanor said, dropping into a careful curtsy, uncertain if she was performing it correctly. "I confess I was quite surprised to receive it." "Nonsense. I enjoyed our conversation immensely, and thought you might enjoy a proper cup of tea rather than shivering outside a chapel." The Duchess gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit." They spoke for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing easily despite the difference in their stations. The Duchess asked about Eleanor's father's former business, about the books she had read, about her opinions on subjects most society ladies were never asked to consider. Eleanor found herself relaxing, forgetting momentarily that she sat within the walls of one of the grandest estates in the county. It was during a lull in their conversation that the drawing-room door opened, and Edmund entered, clearly expecting only his grandmother. He stopped short at the sight of the unfamiliar young woman seated across from her, dressed simply, but with an unmistakable grace in her posture. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Ah, Edmund," the Duchess said, her voice carrying just a touch too much innocence. "Do come in. This is Miss Eleanor Whitfield. Miss Whitfield, my grandson, Edmund." Eleanor rose and curtsied again, her cheeks warming slightly under his gaze. "Your Grace." Edmund inclined his head, his expression carefully neutral, though inwardly he was already calculating the odds that this meeting was entirely coincidental. Knowing his grandmother, the odds were slim indeed. Still, he could not deny a flicker of interest as he studied the young woman before him. She did not fidget under his attention, nor did she look away too quickly, nor did she gaze at him with the transparent hope he had grown so accustomed to seeing in other women's eyes. She simply looked at him, curious and unhurried, as though he were merely a man and not a title. "Please, join us," the Duchess said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Edmund sat, if only to avoid the appearance of rudeness, though every instinct urged him to make an excuse and retreat to his study. The conversation resumed, and he found himself drawn into it despite his reservations, offering his opinion on a book Eleanor mentioned, a well-known treatise on agricultural reform that he had read the previous winter. "I found the author's conclusions rather idealistic," Edmund said. "He assumes farmers will adopt new methods simply because they are proven more efficient, without accounting for the fact that most men resist change, regardless of its merit." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze directly. "But is it not equally idealistic to assume men will remain forever resistant, simply because change is difficult? Someone must be the first to try, or nothing improves at all." Edmund blinked, momentarily thrown by the ease with which she disagreed with him. Most women in his experience either avoided contradicting him entirely, or did so with such exaggerated deference that it hardly counted as disagreement at all. Eleanor simply stated her opinion, calmly and clearly, as though it had not occurred to her that a duke might expect otherwise. "You disagree with me rather boldly for a first meeting," he said, though there was no real irritation in his voice, only a faint curiosity. "I disagree with anyone whose reasoning I find incomplete, Your Grace, regardless of how many meetings we have shared," Eleanor replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I hope that does not offend you." "It does not," Edmund said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it. The Duchess watched this exchange with barely concealed satisfaction, sipping her tea and saying nothing, content to let the conversation unfold on its own. She had not been wrong about this young woman. There was a spark in her that Edmund's usual companions entirely lacked, a willingness to engage rather than merely admire. The visit stretched well beyond the hour originally intended, and by the time Eleanor rose to leave, the awkwardness of the initial introduction had faded into something warmer, though neither she nor Edmund could quite name it. As the carriage was called to return her to Thornbury, Edmund found himself, against every instinct of self-preservation he had cultivated over the years, hoping she might be invited again. It was only after Eleanor had departed that the full weight of the encounter settled over her. Alone in the carriage, she pressed a hand to her flushed cheek and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine what it might feel like to be seen not as a burden or a charity case, but as an equal. Yet as the carriage rolled through the gates of Ashworth Hall and back toward the modest lanes of Thornbury, doubt crept in behind the warmth. She was the daughter of a ruined merchant, caring for an ailing aunt in a cottage with a leaking roof. He was a duke, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in England. Whatever pleasant conversation had passed between them that afternoon, she reminded herself sternly, meant nothing beyond an old woman's idle curiosity. She did not yet know that Duchess Margaret Ashworth rarely acted on idle curiosity alone, and that the wheels of something far larger than a single afternoon's tea had already begun to turn. That evening, once Eleanor had gone, Edmund lingered in the drawing room long after his grandmother had retired for the night. He stood by the window, staring out at the darkened gardens, replaying the conversation in his mind. He could not recall the last time a woman had challenged him so directly, or made him laugh, genuinely laugh, at a clever remark rather than a rehearsed jest. He told himself it meant nothing. A pleasant afternoon, nothing more. He had learned, painfully, not to trust pleasant afternoons, for they had a way of curdling into disappointment once the initial charm wore thin, and the calculation beneath it revealed itself. And yet, some stubborn corner of his mind refused to dismiss Eleanor Whitfield quite so easily, replaying her words, her steady gaze, the small, unguarded smile she had offered when she disagreed with him. He did not sleep easily that night either. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, his restlessness did not feel entirely unwelcome. Word of the visit traveled quickly through Thornbury, as word of anything unusual always did in a village so small. By the following morning, the baker's wife had already heard that Eleanor Whitfield had taken tea at Ashworth Hall, and by midday half the village seemed to know of it, though the details grew more exaggerated with each retelling. Some claimed the Duke himself had called upon Eleanor at her cottage. Others whispered that a betrothal was already being arranged. Eleanor bore the gossip with quiet patience, correcting the wilder rumors when she could, and ignoring the rest. "You must be careful, dear," Aunt Beatrice warned one evening, as they sat together by the fire. "Village talk has a way of taking on a life of its own, and if the Duke's family hears exaggerated tales, it may sour their opinion of you before you have even had the chance to prove yourself." "There is nothing to prove, Aunt," Eleanor said, though she did not entirely believe her own words. "It was a single visit. I doubt it will be repeated." But it was repeated. 3 days later, when another letter arrived, this time inviting Eleanor to assist the Duchess with a task at Ashworth Hall itself. The letter explained that the family's library had fallen into disorder over the years, its shelves crowded with books that had never been properly catalogued, and the Duchess required someone with a keen mind and a love of reading to help set it right. Eleanor, who had spent countless hours devouring every book she could borrow from the vicar, felt a small thrill at the prospect, quite separate from any thought of Edmund. She arrived at Ashworth Hall the following week, dressed in her second-best gown, prepared for an afternoon of quiet, solitary work among dusty shelves. She did not expect to find Edmund waiting near the library entrance when Godfrey led her inside. "Your Grace," she said, startled, "I did not expect to see you here. Nor did I expect to be here," Edmund admitted, a faint, wry smile crossing his face. "My grandmother informed me this morning that I have neglected this library for years and that I ought to take an interest in its restoration, given that I am, apparently, the only person in this household who still reads for pleasure rather than obligation." Eleanor glanced around the vast room, its shelves stretching 2 stories high, ladders positioned at intervals to reach the highest volumes. Dust motes drifted lazily in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "Neglected, perhaps, but beautiful." "It was my father's favorite room," Edmund said, and something in his voice shifted, quieter and more guarded than before. "He used to read to me here, when I was very young. After he died, I found it difficult to spend much time within these walls." Eleanor said nothing immediately, sensing the weight behind his words. She had learned, through years of caring for her aunt and burying her own father, that grief did not always want comfort or advice. Sometimes it simply wanted to be acknowledged without judgment. "Grief has a way of making even the most familiar places feel foreign," she said finally. "I understand that more than you might expect." Edmund glanced at her, surprised by the simplicity and honesty of her response. Most people, upon learning of his parents' deaths, either offered hollow condolences or changed the subject entirely, uncomfortable with the weight of genuine sorrow. Eleanor did neither. She simply sat with the truth of it, allowing it space to exist without trying to smooth it over. They spent the following hours working side by side, sorting volumes by subject, dusting worn leather spines, occasionally pausing when one of them discovered a particularly interesting title. Edmund found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did, drawn into easy conversation about books, philosophy, and eventually, cautiously, about his own life. He spoke of the pressure of managing the estate at such a young age, the loneliness of a title that seemed to attract only those who wanted something from him. Eleanor listened without interrupting, offering small observations rather than empty sympathy, and slowly, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, the careful distance between Duke and companion began to soften into something closer to friendship. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, Eleanor realized with a start how much time had passed. "I should return home, Your Grace. My aunt will worry." "Of course," Edmund said, though there was a note of reluctance in his voice that surprised even him. "Thank you, Miss Whitfield, for your help today. And for your company." "It was my pleasure," Eleanor replied, and meant it entirely. As her carriage rolled away from Ashworth Hall for the second time, Eleanor found herself smiling softly to herself, a warmth spreading through her chest that she did not entirely understand. She told herself once again that it meant nothing beyond pleasant conversation and shared interests. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, hopeful voice refused to be silenced entirely. Neither Eleanor nor Edmund yet knew that their growing ease with one another had already attracted notice, not only from the Duchess, who observed it all with quiet delight, but from someone else entirely, someone with far less generous intentions toward their unlikely friendship. Lord Callahan Whitmore had been watching Edmund's movements for weeks, ever since word had reached him that the Duke's usual pattern of swift rejection had, for once, failed to repeat itself. Callahan was a man of considerable charm and considerable debt, the kind of debt that could only be solved through a fortunate marriage, and he had spent the better part of 2 years positioning his younger sister, Lady Vivian, as the ideal match for the Duke of Ashworth. Vivian was beautiful, accomplished, and utterly indifferent to Edmund personally, but Callahan cared little for her feelings on the matter. What mattered was the alliance, the fortune, the escape from the mounting bills that threatened to expose his family's financial ruin to all of society. When he learned that Edmund had spent an entire afternoon in the library of Ashworth Hall with an unknown young woman of no fortune and no title, Callahan felt the first stirrings of alarm. He made discreet inquiries and soon learned her name, her modest circumstances, and the fact that the Duchess herself had orchestrated the introduction. A companion's niece, Callahan said dismissively to his sister over dinner that evening, though his tone carried more calculation than dismissal. Nothing to concern ourselves with. The Duke will grow bored of her novelty soon enough, as he does with everything. But privately, Callahan was not so certain. He had heard, through servants eager for coin, that the Duke had returned to the library 3 more times that week, and that the housekeeper had remarked upon seeing him laugh, actually laugh, in a manner none of the staff could recall witnessing in years. This was not the behavior of a man merely passing time with an amusing distraction. This was something Callahan recognized with growing unease as genuine interest, and genuine interest threatened everything he had worked to arrange. He decided, over the following days, that if he could not compete with Eleanor Whitfield through charm or connection, he would simply remove her from consideration entirely, through whatever means proved most efficient. Meanwhile, at Ashworth Hall, the library restoration had become something of a daily ritual. Eleanor arrived most afternoons, sometimes accompanied by the Duchess, though increasingly the two of them found themselves working alone, absorbed in conversation that wandered far beyond the books surrounding them. Edmund found himself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that both pleased and unsettled him. He had spent so many years guarding himself against exactly this kind of vulnerability, and yet with Eleanor, the guarding felt less like protection and more like exhaustion. "You seem different today," Eleanor observed one afternoon, watching him stare absently at a book he had not turned a single page of in nearly 10 minutes. "Do I?" Edmund set the book aside, meeting her gaze. "I suppose I have been thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "About how strange it is that I have spent more honest conversation with you in these past 2 weeks than I have with anyone else in the past 2 years, myself included." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, though she did not look away. "Perhaps that says less about me and more about the people you have surrounded yourself with, Your Grace." "Perhaps," Edmund agreed. "Or perhaps it says something about you specifically." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither had yet dared to name aloud. It was Eleanor who broke it first, rising to retrieve another stack of books, though her hands trembled slightly as she did so. "You flatter me," she said lightly, though her voice betrayed the effort it took to sound unaffected. "I rarely flatter anyone," Edmund replied. "Ask my grandmother. She will tell you I am notoriously stingy with compliments." Eleanor laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to fill the vast library more thoroughly than any of the sunlight streaming through its windows. Edmund found himself watching her, memorizing the sound, wondering how he had managed to live so long without hearing anything quite like it. It was during one such afternoon that Eleanor finally opened up about her father, the merchant whose failed investments had cost the family nearly everything. She spoke of watching him grow ill under the weight of his debts, of nursing him through his final months while creditors circled like vultures, of the shame she had felt when neighbors who once respected her family began to look away when passing her in the street. "I do not tell you this for pity," she said, her voice steady despite the difficult subject. "I tell you because I think you understand what it means to lose someone while the entire world watches and judges how you grieve." Edmund reached out, almost without thinking, and covered her hand with his own. "I do understand," he said quietly, "more than I have ever told anyone." For a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of shared understanding settling between them like something solid and real. It was Godfrey's discreet cough from the doorway, announcing the arrival of afternoon tea, that finally broke the spell, and both of them pulled back, faces flushed, unwilling to meet the other's eyes for several minutes afterward. That evening, walking through the gardens after Eleanor had departed, Edmund found his grandmother waiting for him near the old fountain that had been his mother's favorite spot. "You are falling for her," the Duchess said, not as a question. "I do not know what I am doing," Edmund admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the confession. "I only know that when I am with her, I do not feel the need to guard myself the way I do with everyone else." "That is precisely what falling in love feels like, my dear boy," the Duchess said, a knowing smile softening her weathered face. "Do not fight it simply because it frightens you." Edmund said nothing, but he did not argue either, and the Duchess took that as answer enough. Unbeknownst to either of them, Callahan had already set his plans into motion. He began, subtly at first, spreading whispered rumors among his social circle, suggesting that Eleanor Whitfield was not the innocent, unassuming young woman she appeared to be, but rather a calculating opportunist who had deliberately positioned herself to seduce the Duchess's sympathy and, through her, the Duke's affections. He hinted that her father's ruin had not been due to misfortune alone, but to dishonest dealings that had ruined several respectable families alongside his own. None of it was true, But truth mattered little to Callahan when reputation could be dismantled far more easily than it could be built. The rumors spread slowly at first, whispered behind fans at social gatherings, mentioned in passing over card games and evening strolls. But rumors, once released, had a way of growing teeth of their own, and within a fortnight, they had traveled far enough that they reached the ears of several prominent families who had once considered inviting Eleanor and her aunt to modest social functions. Aunt Beatrice noticed the change first, when a longtime acquaintance crossed the street rather than exchange pleasantries during their usual Sunday walk. She said nothing to Eleanor at first, hoping it was merely her imagination, but when a second acquaintance offered only a stiff, hurried greeting the following week, she could no longer ignore the pattern. "Something is wrong," she said one evening, watching Eleanor mend a stocking by candlelight. "People are behaving strangely toward us." "I have noticed it too," Eleanor admitted quietly. "I assumed it was merely village gossip about the visits to Ashworth Hall. I did not think it would turn unkind so quickly." But it had turned unkind, more quickly and more thoroughly than either of them realized, and the source of that unkindness was watching from the shadows of London society, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to ensure that Eleanor Whitfield's brief, unlikely happiness would come crashing down entirely. The following week, when Eleanor arrived at Ashworth Hall for what had become her customary visit, she noticed immediately that something had shifted in the household's atmosphere. Godfrey greeted her with his usual politeness, but there was a stiffness to it that had not been present before. A maid she passed in the corridor lowered her eyes rather than offering the friendly nod Eleanor had grown accustomed to receiving. She found Edmund in the library, but he seemed distracted, his responses shorter than usual, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the window as though his thoughts were elsewhere entirely. Eleanor did not yet know what had reached his ears, only that something had changed, and the warmth that had grown so steadily between them over the past weeks now felt fragile, uncertain, threatened by forces neither of them fully understood. She left that afternoon with a knot of anxiety settling in her chest, uncertain whether the sudden distance was her imagination or something far more real and far more dangerous. Edmund, for his part, had indeed heard fragments of the rumors circulating through his social circle, though he had dismissed most of them as the usual idle gossip that seemed to follow any unmarried woman who dared to spend time in his company. A fellow peer had mentioned, almost in passing during a card game, that people were saying Miss Whitfield had set her sights on the family fortune long before the Duchess had ever noticed her at the chapel. Edmund had laughed off the suggestion at the time, certain it was nothing more than jealousy from families who had failed to secure his attention for their own daughters. But the comment lingered, nonetheless, planting a small seed of doubt he did not entirely wish to acknowledge. He had been wrong about people before, trusted the wrong smiles, believed the wrong promises. Was it truly so impossible that Eleanor, however genuine she seemed, harbored ambitions she had simply hidden more skillfully than the others? He hated himself for even entertaining the thought, yet once planted, doubt proved difficult to uproot entirely. The Duchess noticed his distraction as well, and confronted him directly one evening after dinner. "You have grown quiet these past few days," she observed. "Ever since your last visit with Miss Whitfield." "It is nothing," Edmund said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Edmund." His grandmother's voice carried a warning he recognized from childhood, the tone she used when she suspected he was hiding something from her. "What have you heard?" He sighed, finally admitting the rumors that had reached him, watching his grandmother's expression harden with each word. "And you believe them?" she asked, her voice sharp with disappointment. "I did not say I believed them," Edmund replied defensively. "I only said I had heard them." "There is a difference between hearing something and allowing it to change how you look at a person," the Duchess said. "Tell me honestly, grandson, has your manner toward her changed since you heard these whispers?" Edmund did not answer immediately, and his silence was answer enough. "I raised you better than this," the Duchess said, rising from her chair with the weary disappointment of someone who had hoped, however briefly, that her grandson had finally learned to trust his own judgment over the poisonous whispers of society. "That girl has shown you nothing but honesty since the moment we met her. She has never once asked you for anything, never angled for an invitation, never behaved with anything less than complete integrity. And yet the moment a few bitter tongues suggest otherwise, you retreat into suspicion as though it were your natural state." "It is not suspicion, grandmother, it is caution," Edmund said, though even to his own ears the excuse sounded thin. "It is fear," the Duchess corrected firmly. "You are afraid to trust anyone fully, because the moment you do, you risk being hurt again, as you were when your parents died and left you feeling as though love itself could not be relied upon." But Eleanor Whitfield is not your parents, Edmund, and she is certainly not the calculating creature these rumors paint her to be. If you cannot see that for yourself, then perhaps you do not deserve the happiness she offers." Her words struck harder than she likely intended, and Edmund sat in stunned silence long after she had left the room, her final remark echoing uncomfortably in his mind. Over the following days, his behavior toward Eleanor grew increasingly distant, though he could not fully articulate why, even to himself. He canceled one scheduled visit to the library under the excuse of estate business, then another, citing a headache he did not truly have. Eleanor, sensing the shift keenly, did not press him for explanations, though the uncertainty gnawed at her more than she cared to admit. It was Aunt Beatrice who finally voiced what Eleanor had been avoiding. "Perhaps it is for the best," she said gently one evening, noting her niece's subdued mood. "A duke and a merchant's daughter. However pleasant the friendship, dear, you must have known it could not last forever." "I never expected it to last," Eleanor said, though her voice cracked slightly on the words. "I only did not expect it to end so coldly, without explanation." The rumors, meanwhile, continued to spread, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By the time they reached their most exaggerated form, whispered at a fashionable dinner party Callahan attended with calculated satisfaction, Eleanor was being described not merely as an opportunist, but as a woman who had once been dismissed from a previous household for improper conduct, a complete fabrication that Callahan himself had invented and planted with careful precision. Word of this particular rumor reached Thornbury within days, and this time it could not be ignored. The vicar's wife, who had always been kind to Eleanor and her aunt, approached her after Sunday service with obvious discomfort. "I do hope, my dear, that these stories circulating about you are entirely without merit," she said carefully, "though I confess, given the source, I find myself uncertain what to believe." Eleanor felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "What stories?" she asked, though dread already pooled cold in her stomach. The vicar's wife recounted, with obvious reluctance, the fabricated tale of improper conduct, watching Eleanor's face drain of color as she listened. By the time the woman finished speaking, Eleanor understood, with sickening clarity, that someone had deliberately set out to destroy her reputation, and she had no idea who or why. She returned home that afternoon in a daze, her mind racing through every interaction of the past weeks, searching for the source of such deliberate cruelty. It was only that evening, while sharing the details with her aunt, that a name surfaced in her memory, a name Edmund had mentioned once in passing, with obvious distaste, during one of their library conversations: Lord Callahan Whitmore. She did not yet have proof, only a growing suspicion, but the pieces were beginning to align in a way that made her blood run cold. Someone wanted her gone from Edmund's life, badly enough to fabricate lies and destroy her reputation, without hesitation. And whether Edmund himself believed those lies or not, the damage they had already caused, both to her standing in the village and to the fragile trust that had grown between them, felt, in that quiet, aching moment, almost impossible to repair. Eleanor did not return to Ashworth Hall the following week, nor the week after that. She told herself it was pride, that she refused to place herself in a position where she might be judged by a man who had already begun distancing himself before the worst of the rumors even reached him. But beneath the pride lay something rawer and more painful, a fear that if she returned and saw doubt in Edmund's eyes, even for a moment, it would hurt more than she could bear. She threw herself instead into caring for her aunt, whose health had begun to decline further with the arrival of colder weather. The physician's visits grew more frequent, and with them came bills Eleanor had no easy way to pay. She took in additional mending work from the village, sewing late into the night by candlelight, until her eyes ached and her fingers grew stiff and sore. She did not write to Edmund, nor did she send any word explaining her absence. She simply withdrew, quietly and completely, from a friendship that had begun to feel like more than friendship, before it could hurt her any further. Edmund noticed her absence within days, though he told himself, unconvincingly, that it was simply a natural pause in their acquaintance, nothing more. He busied himself with estate matters, attended a handful of social functions he would normally have avoided, and found each of them tediously familiar, filled with the same rehearsed compliments and calculating smiles he had grown so weary of before Eleanor had entered his life. It was at one such gathering, a card party hosted by a minor earl, that Edmund overheard a conversation that changed everything. Lord Callahan, unaware that Edmund stood within earshot behind a tall potted fern, was speaking to another guest in low, satisfied tones about the effectiveness of his recent efforts. "The girl has all but vanished from society," Callahan said, a note of pride coloring his voice. A few well-placed words, and her reputation crumbled faster than I anticipated. The Duke will forget her within the month, and my sister will have her chance at last. Edmund's blood ran cold. He stepped forward, his expression carefully controlled despite the fury building rapidly beneath the surface. "Lord Callahan," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "I did not realize you took such a personal interest in my acquaintances." Callahan's face paled slightly, though he recovered quickly, offering a smooth, practiced smile. "Your Grace, I was merely discussing village gossip, nothing more." "Village gossip that you yourself invented," Edmund said, his voice hardening. "I believe I heard you quite clearly." The color drained further from Callahan's face, but before he could respond, Edmund turned and walked away, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just overheard. Every doubt he had allowed himself to entertain over the past weeks now felt shameful in light of the truth. Eleanor had done nothing wrong. She had never sought his fortune or his title. She had simply been the victim of a jealous, desperate man willing to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to secure his own financial salvation. Edmund returned to Ashworth Hall that same night, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything beyond the guilt clawing at his chest. He had allowed rumors, however briefly, to color his judgment of a woman who had shown him nothing but honesty since the day they met. He had distanced himself from her when she needed steadiness most, and in doing so, he had likely caused her real and lasting harm. He confronted his grandmother the following morning, recounting everything he had overheard. "I told you," the Duchess said quietly, though there was no satisfaction in her voice, only sorrow. "I told you she deserved your trust, and instead you allowed doubt to take root. What do you intend to do now?" "I intend to make this right," Edmund said firmly, "whatever it takes." He gathered what evidence he could over the following days, questioning servants who had overheard Callahan's schemes, tracing the origin of the rumors back through the social circles they had traveled, until he had assembled enough proof to expose Callahan's deception beyond any reasonable doubt. It was during this investigation that he also discovered something that shamed him further still, a detail his grandmother mentioned almost in passing. "Did you know," the Duchess said, "that Eleanor once refused a gift I offered her, a modest sum, intended to help with her aunt's medical expenses. She thanked me graciously and declined, saying she could not accept charity for work she had not yet performed, and that she preferred to earn whatever assistance she received." Edmund had not known this. It settled over him like a physical weight, further evidence of exactly the kind of integrity the rumors had so viciously denied her. He rode to Thornbury the following afternoon, unannounced, arriving at the small cottage just as dusk began to settle over the village. Eleanor answered the door herself, her expression shifting from surprise to guarded wariness at the sight of him standing on her doorstep. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I did not expect a visit." "Eleanor, please," Edmund said, and something in his tone, raw and unguarded, made her pause. "May I speak with you? I have wronged you, and I need the chance to explain myself." She hesitated for a long moment, torn between the hurt still lingering in her chest and the evident sincerity in his expression. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing him into the small, warm kitchen where Aunt Beatrice sat by the fire, watching the exchange with quiet, careful interest. "I heard the rumors," Edmund began, once they had settled at the small wooden table, "and I confess, for a brief time, I allowed them to affect how I treated you. I distanced myself when you needed steadiness, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Eleanor's expression remained guarded. "You believed I would use an old woman's kindness to advance myself, that I would use you. I did not believe it fully," Edmund admitted, "but I allowed the doubt to exist, and that alone was a betrayal of the trust you had shown me. I have since learned the truth. Lord Callahan invented every word of those rumors, out of jealousy and desperation to secure his own family's fortune through his sister's marriage to me. I overheard him confess it himself." Eleanor absorbed this in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "And what do you intend to do with this knowledge?" "I intend to correct it," Edmund said firmly. "Publicly, if necessary. I will not allow your name to remain tarnished by another man's schemes. And if I no longer wish to be associated with a family whose trust can be so easily swayed by whispered gossip," Eleanor asked, her voice quiet but firm, years of quiet dignity refusing to bend simply because a duke had appeared at her door with an apology. Edmund's expression faltered, the weight of her words landing with more force than he had anticipated. "Then I would understand," he said slowly. "But I hope, in time, you might allow me the chance to prove that my regard for you was never dependent on the opinions of others, however loudly they whispered." Eleanor said nothing further that evening. though she did not turn him away entirely either. As Edmund rode back toward Ashworth Hall beneath a darkening sky, he understood, with painful clarity, that an apology alone would not be enough to repair what had been damaged. He would need to prove himself, through action rather than mere words, that his feelings for Eleanor Whitfield were as steady and unshakable as she deserved. The following morning, Edmund summoned his solicitor and requested a full accounting of Lord Callahan's outstanding debts, information he suspected would prove useful in understanding the true depth of the man's desperation. What he discovered exceeded even his darkest assumptions. Callahan owed considerable sums to no fewer than 6 different creditors, several of whom had already begun quiet legal proceedings to recover what they were owed. His family's estate, once modestly prosperous, had been mortgaged twice over, and only the appearance of continued respectability had kept the full scope of the ruin from becoming public knowledge. It explained everything. Callahan's desperate scheme to secure his sister's marriage to Edmund was not merely ambition, but survival. Yet understanding the motive did nothing to excuse the cruelty of the method, and Edmund found no sympathy for the man stirring within him, only a cold, quiet resolve to see the truth exposed. He also visited the servants who had first carried word of the rumors, gently pressing them for details of where they had first heard such stories. Most traced back, eventually, to a valet in Callahan's employ, a man easily persuaded, with the promise of discretion and modest payment, to confirm that his master had indeed instructed him to spread specific stories about Miss Whitfield throughout the village and among their social circle. With this evidence gathered, Edmund faced a choice. He could confront Callahan privately, demanding he cease the rumors and quietly retract what damage could still be undone, or he could expose the deception publicly, at significant risk to his own reputation, ensuring that Eleanor's name was fully and unmistakably restored. He chose, without hesitation, the latter path. In the days that followed, Edmund did not return immediately to Thornbury, understanding that Eleanor needed time and space to process what had happened between them, rather than another hurried visit that might feel more like pressure than genuine amends. Instead, he began quietly laying the groundwork for a public reckoning, one that would leave no room for doubt about where the true fault for the rumors lay. He spoke first with his grandmother, explaining his plan in careful detail. "You intend to confront him at Lady Ashcombe's gathering," the Duchess said, understanding immediately the significance of his choice. The upcoming event was one of the most prominent social gatherings of the season, attended by nearly every family whose opinion mattered within the ton, including, notably, several of the same individuals who had first spread and repeated Callahan's fabricated stories. "I do," Edmund confirmed. "It is the same stage upon which the rumors first spread most widely. It seems only fitting that the truth should be revealed there as well." "It is a risk," the Duchess warned. "Public accusations, however justified, invite scrutiny of your own judgment as well. People will ask why you allowed such rumors to take root in the first place, why you distanced yourself from Miss Whitfield before learning the truth." "Let them ask," Edmund said firmly. "I would rather face uncomfortable questions about my own failings than allow Eleanor to continue bearing the weight of lies she never deserved." The Duchess studied her grandson for a long moment, something like pride softening the worry in her expression. "You have changed, Edmund. These past weeks, whatever pain they have caused, have changed you for the better." "Eleanor changed me," Edmund admitted quietly, "long before I understood what was happening." Meanwhile, in Thornbury, Eleanor continued her quiet, careful days, though her thoughts returned again and again to Edmund's visit, to the raw sincerity in his voice as he had apologized, to the question of whether she could risk trusting him again after being so thoroughly hurt. Aunt Beatrice, watching her niece's distracted mending and unfinished sentences, finally broached the subject directly one evening. "You still care for him," she said gently, "whatever has happened between you." Eleanor set down her needlework, unable to deny it any longer. "I do. And that frightens me more than the rumors ever did. If I allow myself to trust him again, and he doubts me once more when the next difficulty arises, I do not know that I could recover from it a second time." "No one can promise you certainty in matters of the heart, dear," Aunt Beatrice said, reaching for her niece's hand. "Not even a duke, but a man who rides to your door the moment he learns the truth, who apologizes without excuse, who sets about correcting his mistake rather than simply hoping it fades away. That is not nothing, Eleanor. That is worth considering carefully, rather than dismissing out of fear alone." Eleanor said nothing, but her aunt's words lingered long after the conversation ended, settling into the quiet corners of her mind alongside every memory of afternoons spent laughing over books in a grand, sunlit library, and the steady warmth of Edmund's hand covering hers in a moment of shared understanding. She did not yet know of the plan taking shape at Ashworth Hall, nor of the public reckoning Edmund intended to orchestrate on her behalf. She knew only that her heart, however cautious, had not yet given up on the possibility of something real. The invitation to Lady Ashcomb's gathering arrived at the cottage 3 days later, delivered by the same liveried footman who had first brought word from Ashworth Hall. Eleanor stared at the elegant script for a long moment before breaking the seal, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The letter, penned in the Duchess's own hand, explained that she wished for Eleanor to attend as her personal guest, and that a carriage would be sent to collect her on the appointed evening. "You must go," Aunt Beatrice said firmly, when Eleanor hesitated over the invitation. "Whatever waits for you there, hiding away in Thornbury will not undo the damage already done to your name. You must face it directly, with your head held high." Eleanor knew her aunt was right, though the thought of standing before the very people who had so readily believed the worst of her filled her with quiet dread. She had no way of knowing that Edmund intended to use the occasion to publicly dismantle every lie Callahan had constructed, and so she prepared for the evening expecting only judgment and cold civility, bracing herself as best she could. She wore her mother's pale blue gown once more, the only garment fine enough for such an occasion, though she took extra care with her appearance that evening, arranging her hair with unusual precision, as though presenting herself with dignity might, in some small way, counter the ugliness of the rumors that had followed her for weeks. Lady Ashcomb's townhouse in London blazed with candlelight when Eleanor's carriage arrived, music and laughter spilling out into the cool evening air. She entered on the arm of a footman, her chin lifted despite the nervous flutter in her chest, and immediately felt the weight of curious, calculating stares following her through the crowded ballroom. Whispers rippled in her wake, some cruel, some merely curious, but all of them uncomfortably loud in the confined space of her own awareness. She found the Duchess near the refreshment table, and the older woman greeted her warmly, deliberately, as though daring anyone watching to question the association. "You look lovely, my dear," the Duchess said, taking Eleanor's hands in her own. "Stay close to me this evening. There are matters that require attention, and I would have you present to witness their resolution." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, a hush began to ripple through the crowd as Edmund entered the ballroom, tall and composed, his expression carrying none of the guarded distance that had marked their last painful conversation. His eyes found Eleanor almost immediately, and something in his gaze, warm and unwavering, steadied the anxious flutter in her chest, if only slightly. He crossed the room directly toward her, ignoring the several attempts by other guests to draw him into conversation along the way, and bowed formally before her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, loudly enough for those nearby to hear clearly, "I am glad you came this evening. There is something I wish to say, and I would have you hear it directly, rather than through the distortion of village gossip." The murmuring crowd grew quieter still, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Across the room, Lord Callahan, who had been engaged in idle conversation with a group of fellow peers, turned at the sound of Edmund's raised voice, his expression shifting rapidly from mild curiosity to visible alarm as he registered the direction of the Duke's attention. "Several weeks ago," Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly across the now nearly silent ballroom, rumors began to circulate regarding Miss Eleanor Whitfield, suggesting dishonesty, opportunism, and conduct entirely unbefitting a woman of her genuine character. "I confess, to my great shame, that I allowed these rumors to affect my own judgment, however briefly, before I discovered the truth of their origin." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the crowd. Callahan's face had gone pale, his hand tightening visibly around the stem of his wineglass. "I have since learned," Edmund continued, his gaze sweeping deliberately across the assembled guests before settling, finally, on Callahan himself, that these rumors were entirely fabricated, invented and deliberately spread by a man desperate to secure his own family's financial salvation through an advantageous marriage. "I have gathered evidence, including the testimony of servants employed in his own household, confirming beyond doubt that Lord Callahan Whitmore invented these stories from nothing, in a calculated attempt to destroy Miss Whitfield's reputation and remove her as an obstacle to his ambitions." The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers, dozens of heads turning simultaneously toward Callahan, whose composure had entirely crumbled under the weight of public exposure. He opened his mouth to protest, but no coherent defense emerged, only a stammering denial that convinced no one, least of all himself. "Your Grace, I assure you, this is a gross misrepresentation," Callahan finally managed, though his voice lacked any real conviction. I have the sworn statement of your own valet, Lord Callahan, Edmund replied coldly, along with confirmation from no fewer than 3 separate individuals who heard you boast of your success in destroying Miss Whitfield's standing. I would advise against further denial. It only compounds the dishonor you have already brought upon yourself. Callahan's sister, Lady Vivian, standing nearby, looked equally horrified, though whether at her brother's exposed deception or the public humiliation now attached to her own name, it was difficult to say. She quietly excused herself from the gathering moments later, her face flushed with mortification, leaving Callahan to face the crowd's judgment entirely alone. Edmund turned back to Eleanor, his expression softening from the cold authority he had directed at Callahan into something far gentler. Miss Whitfield deserves this room's sincere apology, he said, as she deserves mine, for ever allowing doubt to cloud what has always been evident to anyone who took the time to truly know her. She is a woman of exceptional honesty, kindness, and integrity, qualities I have witnessed firsthand, and qualities that no amount of jealous scheming can diminish. The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of public correction settling over the assembled guests. Then, slowly, one by one, several of the very individuals who had whispered the loudest about Eleanor's supposed misconduct began offering quiet, awkward apologies, unwilling to be seen as continuing to align themselves with a man so thoroughly and publicly disgraced. Eleanor stood frozen through much of the exchange, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from quiet dread to public vindication. When Edmund finally turned to her directly, his eyes searching hers for some sign of how she had received his words, she found herself unable to speak at first, emotion closing her throat entirely. I did this because you deserve the truth to be known, Edmund said quietly, for her ears alone now, the crowd's attention having shifted toward Callahan's hasty, humiliated departure from the gathering. Whatever you decide regarding us, I needed you to know that your name would never again be tarnished by lies I allowed to take root through my own doubt. Thank you, Eleanor finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. I did not expect this. I did not expect any of it. I know I hurt you, Edmund continued, his voice low and earnest. And I understand if that hurt cannot be undone simply through a public correction of rumors, however necessary. But I hope, in time, you might allow me to prove that my regard for you has never wavered in truth, only in the outward appearance of it, and that my failure was one of courage, not of feeling. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, the ballroom around them fading into distant, unimportant noise. She thought of the weeks of quiet dread, the whispered rumors, the anxious nights wondering whether trust, once broken, could ever be fully restored. But she thought too of the man standing before her now, who had risked his own standing among his peers to correct a wrong done to a woman with no fortune, no title, and no power to repay him beyond her own honest gratitude. I am not yet ready to promise anything, she said finally, honestly. But I am willing to allow you the chance to prove yourself, if you are willing to be patient. I have waited my entire life without realizing it for someone worth being patient for, Edmund said, a genuine smile breaking across his features for the first time that evening. I can certainly manage a little longer. The weeks that followed brought a slow, careful rebuilding of trust between them. Edmund visited Thornbury regularly, no longer disguising his intentions behind excuses of library restoration or estate business, but simply calling upon Eleanor and her aunt as an honest suitor, patient and attentive, never pressing for more than she was ready to offer. He assisted quietly, without fanfare, in arranging better medical care for Aunt Beatrice, though he took great care to frame it as gratitude for her niece's help with the library, rather than charity that might wound Eleanor's fierce independence. Slowly, the warmth that had first blossomed between them in the sunlit library returned, stronger now for having weathered genuine hardship, tempered by honesty rather than mere pleasant circumstance. Eleanor found herself laughing more easily in his company, trusting more fully with each visit, and Edmund, in turn, found the careful walls he had built around his heart since childhood growing thinner with every conversation, every shared silence, every moment of quiet understanding between them. Lord Callahan, disgraced beyond recovery within London society, quietly retreated from public life altogether, his mounting debts finally catching up with him in full view of a society no longer willing to extend him credit or sympathy. His sister, Lady Vivian, distanced herself entirely from his schemes, eventually marrying a modest but respectable gentleman from the countryside, far removed from the ambitious circles her brother had once hoped to conquer. And in Thornbury, as autumn deepened toward winter, Eleanor Whitfield began, cautiously and then with growing certainty, to believe that perhaps happiness was not a dream reserved for those born to fortune and title alone, but something that could be earned, honestly and patiently, even by a merchant's daughter who had once believed such things were forever beyond her reach. Word of Callahan's public disgrace traveled through Thornbury nearly as quickly as the original rumors had, and this time the village's opinion of Eleanor shifted decisively in her favor. The vicar's wife, who had once approached her with such uncomfortable suspicion, now greeted her warmly each Sunday, going out of her way to express regret for ever giving credence to such baseless gossip. The blacksmith's wife and the baker's son, who had never truly doubted Eleanor's character to begin with, seemed almost smug in their vindication, reminding anyone who would listen that they had always known the rumors were nonsense. Eleanor accepted these renewed courtesies with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the ordeal, neither gloating over her vindication, nor dwelling bitterly on those who had so readily believed the worst of her. She had learned, through the difficult weeks of whispered judgment, that the opinions of others, however painful in the moment, could not ultimately define her own sense of self-worth. That certainty, hard-won through genuine hardship, had left her steadier and more confident than she had ever been before. Edmund noticed this quiet strength in her more with each passing visit, and it deepened his admiration considerably. Where other women of his acquaintance might have basked endlessly in public vindication, demanding apologies and retribution from every individual who had wronged them, Eleanor simply resumed her quiet life, tending to her aunt, mending garments for the village, reading in the evenings by candlelight, as though the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a passing storm to be weathered with patience rather than anger. "You do not seem angry," Edmund observed one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens of Ashworth Hall, autumn leaves crunching softly beneath their feet. "After everything Callahan did, after everything you suffered because of his lies, I would understand if you harbored considerable resentment." "I was angry," Eleanor admitted. "Deeply so, for a time. But anger, I have found, tends to consume the one who holds it far more than the one it is directed toward. Lord Callahan will face the consequences of his own choices, his debts, his ruined reputation, without any additional bitterness from me. I would rather spend my energy on happiness than on grievance." Edmund considered her words in thoughtful silence for a long moment. "I envy that clarity," he said finally. "I have spent years nursing my own grievances, guarding myself so thoroughly against further hurt that I nearly missed the chance to know you at all." "You did not miss it," Eleanor said gently, stopping to face him directly. "You are here now. That is what matters." Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded slowly over the following weeks, marked not by grand romantic gestures but by countless small moments of genuine connection. Edmund taught Eleanor to ride, patiently guiding her through her early nervous attempts atop a gentle mare from the estate's stables, laughing warmly at her indignant insistence that she was managing perfectly well despite her obvious unease. Eleanor, in turn, introduced Edmund to the simple pleasures of village life he had long forgotten, walking with him through Thornbury's modest market square, teaching him to recognize the different herbs she dried above her hearth, sharing stories of her father's better days before illness and financial ruin had claimed him. Aunt Beatrice's health, meanwhile, continued to improve steadily under the care of a physician Edmund had quietly arranged, though he took great pains to ensure Eleanor never felt the assistance as anything other than genuine friendship rather than charity. The old woman, sharp-eyed despite her frailty, saw through his careful discretion easily enough, and found herself growing genuinely fond of the Duke who visited so faithfully, never once treating her modest cottage, or her niece's circumstances with anything less than complete respect. "You have chosen well, Eleanor," Aunt Beatrice remarked one evening, after Edmund had departed following a lengthy visit filled with easy laughter and comfortable silences. "I have seen many suitors pass through this village over the years, dear, and never one who looked at a woman quite the way that young man looks at you." "We are simply friends, Aunt," Eleanor protested, though the flush rising to her cheeks suggested otherwise. "Friends do not gaze at one another with such open devotion," Aunt Beatrice said dryly. "Nor do dukes typically arrange discreet medical care for the aunts of mere friends. Do not insult my intelligence, child. I may be old, but I am not blind." Eleanor said nothing further, but she could not entirely suppress the small, hopeful smile that crossed her face as she returned to her mending, her thoughts lingering pleasantly on the memory of Edmund's laughter earlier that evening, warm and unguarded, so different from the cold, distant man she had first encountered outside a chapel weeks before. As winter approached and the first frost settled over Thornbury's quiet lanes, both Eleanor and Edmund found themselves, independently, and without quite admitting it to each other, contemplating a future together that neither had dared to imagine when their unlikely acquaintance first began. The trust broken by Callahan's cruel schemes had been rebuilt, patiently and honestly, into something even stronger than before, tempered by adversity rather than diminished by it. Neither of them yet knew that Duchess Margaret Ashworth, watching their careful, tender courtship unfold with quiet satisfaction, had already begun making her own private preparations. Certain that it would not be long before her grandson finally found the courage to ask the question that had been building steadily in his heart since the very first afternoon he had watched Eleanor Whitfield disagree with him so boldly over dinner, and found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely and thoroughly charmed. Snow had begun to dust the fields surrounding Thornbury by the time Edmund made his decision, arriving unannounced at the cottage on a bright, cold morning with a small wooden box tucked carefully inside his coat pocket. Aunt Beatrice, spotting him through the frosted window, hurried to open the door before he could even knock, her knowing smile suggesting she understood precisely why he had come. "She is out gathering herbs behind the cottage," Aunt Beatrice said, before he could even offer a greeting. "Go on, then. I shall find myself suddenly very occupied indoors for the next hour or so." Edmund found Eleanor exactly where her aunt had said, kneeling in the small garden behind the cottage, carefully wrapping the last of the season's herbs in cloth to preserve them through the coming winter months. She looked up at the sound of his approach, surprise and pleasure mingling openly on her face. "Your Grace," she said, rising and brushing dirt from her hands. "I did not expect you this morning. I could not stay away," Edmund admitted, and something in his voice, unusually nervous, made Eleanor tilt her head curiously. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said quickly. "Nothing is wrong. Everything, in fact, feels remarkably right, for the first time in longer than I can properly remember." He reached for her hands, cold from the morning air, and held them gently within his own. "Eleanor, when I first met you outside that chapel, through my grandmother's careful scheming, I resented the very idea of being managed once again into another tedious introduction. I expected nothing beyond another polite, forgettable conversation. Instead, I found a woman who challenged me, who saw past my title to the man beneath it, who showed me more honesty and genuine understanding in a handful of afternoons than I had received from anyone in years." Eleanor's breath caught, her eyes widening slightly as she began to understand the direction of his words. "I doubted you once," Edmund continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. "I allowed cruelty and jealousy to plant seeds of suspicion where none should have existed, and I have spent every day since determined to prove that such doubt will never again cloud my judgment where you are concerned. You have shown me what it means to be known, truly known, beyond wealth or status, or the endless performance society demands of us both. I do not wish to spend another day without that knowledge, without you." He knelt then, right there in the frost-covered garden, producing the small wooden box from his coat pocket, and opening it to reveal a modest but elegant ring, one that had belonged to his own mother, passed down through generations of the Ashworth family. "Eleanor Whitfield," he said, "will you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife? Not for title, not for fortune, but because you are the only person who has ever refused to let me hide behind either." Eleanor stood in stunned silence for a long moment, tears gathering unbidden in her eyes as the weight of his words settled fully over her. She thought of every hardship that had brought her to this moment, her father's ruin, the years of quiet struggle, the cruel rumors that had nearly destroyed everything before it truly began, and found, standing in her modest garden before a kneeling duke, that none of it mattered any longer beside the simple, overwhelming truth of what she felt for the man before her. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you." He rose swiftly, slipping the ring onto her trembling finger, before drawing her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than any further words could manage. Aunt Beatrice, watching discreetly from the cottage window despite her earlier promise of occupied indifference, could not suppress a small, satisfied laugh at the sight of her niece finally, truly happy. News of the engagement spread through both Thornbury and London society with remarkable speed, though this time the whispers carried genuine warmth rather than cruel speculation. The very families who had once hesitated to associate with Eleanor now competed eagerly for invitations to the upcoming wedding, though Eleanor, with her characteristic quiet dignity, insisted on a modest ceremony rather than the grand spectacle society might have expected from a duke's marriage. Duchess Margaret Ashworth, upon receiving the news, wept openly for the first time in years that Edmund could recall, though her tears were entirely those of joy rather than sorrow. "I knew it," she said, embracing her grandson tightly. "From the very moment I saw her outside that chapel, I knew she was exactly what you needed, though I confess I did not expect quite this much difficulty along the way." "Nor did I," Edmund admitted, laughing softly. "But perhaps the difficulty made the outcome all the sweeter, grandmother. I do not believe I would have recognized Eleanor's worth so fully had it not been tested by hardship." The wedding took place on a crisp winter morning at the same small chapel in Thornbury where Duchess Margaret had first noticed Eleanor's quiet kindness toward strangers. The chapel, though modest compared to the grand cathedrals of London, was filled beyond capacity, with villagers who had known Eleanor her entire life standing alongside members of the aristocracy who had once whispered cruel rumors about her character, now gathered together in genuine celebration of a union built on honesty rather than convenience. Aunt Beatrice, her health considerably improved, sat proudly in the front pew, dabbing at happy tears throughout the ceremony. Duchess Margaret stood as witness, her expression a careful balance of dignified composure and barely contained joy. Even Godfrey, the ever-proper butler of Ashworth Hall, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile as he watched the young duke he had served since childhood finally find happiness after so many years of guarded solitude. Eleanor walked down the modest aisle in a simple gown of pale ivory, far less elaborate than society might have expected, yet she had never looked more radiant, her chin lifted with the same quiet dignity that had first drawn Duchess Margaret's attention months earlier. Edmund watched her approach with an expression of open, unguarded wonder, the careful walls he had built around himself since childhood finally, completely dismantled. "I take you, Eleanor Whitfield, as my wife," he said during the exchange of vows, his voice steady and clear despite the emotion evident beneath it. "Not because society expects it of me, not for any advantage your marriage might bring, but because you alone have taught me what it means to be truly known and truly loved, without condition or calculation." Eleanor in turn spoke her own vows with equal sincerity. "I take you, Edmund Ashworth, as my husband, understanding fully now that love does not require matching fortunes or matching titles, only matching honesty, matching courage, and a willingness to fight for one another even when the world conspires against it." As the ceremony concluded and the small congregation erupted into joyful applause, Edmund drew his new wife into his arms, the weight of years spent guarding himself against vulnerability finally, fully lifted. Outside the chapel, snow had begun to fall gently, dusting the small gathering of well-wishers with a soft, quiet beauty that seemed fitting for the occasion. In the months that followed, Ashworth Hall, once a house defined by grief and careful distance, slowly transformed under Eleanor's gentle influence into a home filled with genuine warmth. She insisted on completing the restoration of the library they had begun together, and the grand room, once neglected and gathering dust, became the heart of the household once more, filled regularly with laughter, quiet reading, and the easy companionship that had first drawn Edmund and Eleanor together. Aunt Beatrice took up residence in a comfortable cottage on the Ashworth estate, close enough for daily visits, her health continuing to improve under steady care, and the joy of watching her niece finally settled into genuine happiness. Duchess Margaret, freed at last from her long campaign of careful matchmaking, found herself content simply to observe her grandson's transformation, the cold, guarded man he had become slowly giving way once more to the warmer, more open boy she remembered from before tragedy had shaped him into someone so thoroughly closed off from the world. Edmund, for his part, discovered a happiness he had genuinely believed himself incapable of experiencing, a steady, quiet contentment built not upon the performance and calculation that had defined so much of his previous life, but upon genuine partnership with a woman who had never once asked him to be anything other than exactly who he was. He no longer dreaded the endless parade of social obligations his title demanded, for he now faced them with Eleanor beside him, her steady presence transforming even the most tedious gatherings into something bearable, even occasionally enjoyable. Lord Callahan, meanwhile, faded entirely from relevance within London society, his mounting debts finally forcing the sale of his family's remaining properties, his name becoming, in time, little more than a cautionary tale whispered among the ton about the dangers of allowing desperation to curdle into cruelty. His sister, Lady Vivian, settled comfortably into her own modest but genuinely happy marriage, occasionally corresponded with Eleanor, the two women having found, somewhat unexpectedly, a quiet friendship in the aftermath of the scandal that had once threatened to divide them entirely. And so the Duke, who had once rejected every noble lady presented to him, found, in the end, that true happiness had never required a title, a fortune, or the careful calculations of society's endless matchmaking schemes. It required only honesty, patience, and the courage to trust fully in another person. Qualities Eleanor Whitfield had possessed in abundance from the very first afternoon. A determined old woman noticed her kindness outside a small village chapel, and decided, quietly and firmly, that this extraordinary woman was exactly the one her grandson needed to finally come home to himself. The first spring of their marriage brought with it a gentle rhythm neither Edmund nor Eleanor had truly anticipated. The grounds of Ashworth Hall, once maintained with formal precision but little genuine attention, began to reflect Eleanor's quiet influence, as she requested modest gardens be planted alongside the manicured hedges, filled with the same herbs and simple flowers she had once grown behind her small cottage. The household staff, who had grown accustomed over the years to a quiet, somber estate, found themselves adjusting happily to a home now filled with warmth, occasional laughter drifting down long corridors that had once echoed only with silence. Eleanor took her new responsibilities as Duchess seriously, though she approached them with the same unpretentious practicality that had defined her entire life. She visited tenant families personally, ensuring their concerns reached Edmund directly, rather than becoming lost within layers of estate management. She established a small fund, modest but meaningful, to assist families in the surrounding villages who faced hardships similar to those she herself had once endured, understanding intimately the quiet desperation that came with genteel poverty and pride too stubborn to accept charity outright. Edmund watched his wife navigate her new position with quiet admiration, noting how quickly the tenants and staff who had once regarded her with curious uncertainty came to genuinely respect and even adore her. She never postured or performed for their benefit, never adopted the distant formalities some might have expected from a new duchess. She simply remained herself, honest and warm, and found that authenticity carried far more weight than any amount of practiced grandeur ever could. Their evenings together became Edmund's favorite part of each day, spent in the newly restored library, Eleanor curled in a chair near the fire with a book, Edmund working through estate correspondence at his desk nearby, occasionally interrupting the comfortable silence to share a particularly interesting passage or seek her opinion on some matter of business. She proved, time and again, to possess a sharp, practical mind that Edmund came to rely upon as genuinely as he had once relied upon his own solitary judgment. Duchess Margaret, observing her grandson and his wife from her own quarters within the hall, found herself increasingly content to step back from the active management of household affairs, trusting Eleanor's capable hands with responsibilities she had once guarded jealously herself. She spent her days now in quieter pursuits, tending her garden, corresponding with old friends, and occasionally, when the mood struck her, offering gentle, unsolicited advice to the young couple whose happiness she had worked so tirelessly to secure. "You have given this old house something it has sorely lacked since your parents passed," she told Edmund one evening, as they walked together through the gardens Eleanor had helped cultivate. "Life, Edmund. Genuine, unguarded life. I worried for so many years that you had lost the capacity for it entirely." "I very nearly had," Edmund admitted. "Had you not persisted in your scheming, grandmother, however much I resented it at the time, I do not know that I would have ever found my way back to it." "Then I shall consider my meddling entirely justified," the Duchess said, a satisfied smile crossing her weathered face, regardless of how much grumbling it earned me at the time. By midsummer, word arrived that Eleanor was expecting their first child, news that spread through both Ashworth Hall and the village of Thornbury with genuine, widespread joy. Aunt Beatrice, her health now fully restored under the steady care Edmund had arranged, wept happy tears upon hearing the news, already planning the small garment she intended to sew for her future grandniece or grandnephew. The pregnancy brought its own quiet challenges, moments of worry and discomfort that tested the young couple's partnership in new ways. Yet through it all, Edmund remained steadily attentive, never once retreating into the distant formality that had once defined his approach to difficulty. He had learned, through the painful lessons of Callahan's cruel scheme and his own initial failure to trust fully, that genuine partnership required presence, especially during the moments that tested it most. Eleanor, for her part, found in motherhood an unexpected continuation of the quiet strength that had carried her through every previous hardship. She approached the uncertainty of impending childbirth with the same calm, practical dignity she had always possessed, though she leaned more openly on Edmund's support than her independent nature might once have allowed, trusting fully now in the steadiness of his devotion. Their daughter arrived on a cold winter morning nearly 1 year after their wedding, healthy and strong, with her mother's steady gaze and, as Duchess Margaret was quick to point out with obvious delight, her father's stubborn chin. They named her Charlotte, after Eleanor's own late mother, and Edmund found himself, holding his newborn daughter for the first time, overwhelmed by an emotion he had not fully permitted himself to feel since the deaths of his own parents so many years before. A fierce, protective love entirely without guard or hesitation. "She will grow up knowing exactly how much she is loved," Edmund murmured to Eleanor, as they sat together in the quiet aftermath of Charlotte's birth, the winter light filtering softly through the nursery windows, not merely told but shown, every single day. "As will any children who follow her," Eleanor said, smiling tiredly but joyfully up at him. "We shall make certain of that together." Years later, when Charlotte had grown old enough to wander the halls of Ashworth Hall on her own small, determined legs, she would often find her way to the great library, drawn instinctively to the same sunlit room where her parents' unlikely love story had first quietly begun. She would climb into her father's lap as he read, or perch beside her mother near the fire, listening to stories of dukes and duchesses, of kindness rewarded and cruelty exposed, never fully realizing that the greatest story of all had unfolded within those very walls, long before she herself had arrived to complete it. And so the Duke, who had once rejected every noble lady presented to him, cold and guarded against a world he trusted little, found in the end that extraordinary love had been waiting all along, not among the glittering ballrooms of London society, but in a modest cottage on the edge of a quiet village, in the steady, unassuming kindness of a woman who had never once sought to win his heart, only to be honestly, fully known. And in finding her, he found, at last, his way home. 3 years after Charlotte's birth, a letter arrived at Ashworth Hall that brought an unexpected chapter to a story Eleanor had long believed fully closed. The letter came from a solicitor in London, informing her that a distant cousin of her late father, a man she had never once met, had passed away without direct heirs, leaving behind a modest but respectable trading business that now, through a complicated chain of inheritance, belonged to her. Eleanor read the letter twice, disbelief plain on her face, before passing it wordlessly to Edmund across the breakfast table. "It seems your father's family was not entirely without fortune after all," Edmund said, scanning the document with growing interest. "Merely scattered across branches you never knew existed." "I do not know what to do with a trading business," Eleanor admitted, though a curious spark had already lit behind her eyes, the same sharp practicality Edmund had come to know so well stirring at the unexpected challenge. "I know nothing of shipping routes or merchant contracts." "You knew nothing of managing a duke's household either, when we married," Edmund pointed out gently, "and you have proven remarkably capable of learning whatever you set your mind toward." Eleanor traveled to London the following month to inspect the business firsthand, accompanied by Edmund, who insisted on supporting her venture though he made clear the decisions would remain entirely hers to make. She found, to her surprise, that her father's old habits of careful bookkeeping and honest dealing had left an impression deep enough that she understood the fundamentals of trade almost instinctively, memories of childhood afternoons spent watching him work resurfacing with unexpected clarity. Rather than selling the business outright, as many in her position might have chosen, Eleanor decided to maintain it under careful, trusted management, directing its modest profits toward the same charitable fund she had established for struggling families near Thornbury and the Ashworth estate. It felt, she told Edmund one evening, like an unexpected way of honoring her father's memory, transforming what had once been a source of family ruin into a source of quiet good for others facing similar hardship. "He would be proud of you," Edmund said simply, watching her review a stack of shipping ledgers with the same careful attention she had once given to cataloging his family's neglected library. "Prouder, I suspect, than he ever managed to express while he lived." Eleanor smiled softly at the thought, grateful for a husband who understood, without needing lengthy explanation, exactly what such gestures meant to her. Back at Ashworth Hall, life continued its steady, contented rhythm. Charlotte grew into a curious, spirited child, inheriting her mother's directness and her father's quiet thoughtfulness in equal measure. She was joined, 2 years later, by a younger brother, whom they named Henry, after Edmund's own father, a choice that brought quiet tears to Duchess Margaret's eyes when she first heard the news. The Duchess herself, though her steps grew slower and her hair turned fully silver with each passing year, remained a steady, beloved presence within the household, delighting in her role as grandmother far more than she had ever anticipated. She spent countless afternoons in the library with Charlotte and Henry, reading them the very same stories she had once read to Edmund as a boy, watching with quiet satisfaction as the walls of Ashworth Hall, once so heavy with grief and careful distance, filled instead with the easy, unguarded laughter of children who had never known anything but genuine love within its rooms. Aunt Beatrice lived long enough to see both children grow past their earliest years, spending her final seasons comfortably in her cottage on the estate grounds, surrounded by the family she had helped raise and the niece she had never stopped being proud of. When she passed peacefully one autumn evening, Eleanor grieved deeply, but found comfort in knowing her aunt had lived to witness the full, happy resolution of a story that had once seemed destined for hardship alone. Lord Callahan's fate, by contrast, continued its quiet decline. Word occasionally reached Ashworth Hall of his diminished circumstances, reduced eventually to a modest existence far removed from the ambitious schemes that had once defined him. Edmund felt no satisfaction in this news, only a distant, faded sense of closure, the anger he had once carried toward the man having long since given way to simple indifference. Eleanor, true to the philosophy she had voiced so many years earlier in the gardens of Ashworth Hall, had never wasted further energy on resentment, choosing instead to pour everything she had into the family and the quiet, meaningful life she had built. As the years passed, Edmund often found himself thinking back to the reluctant, guarded man he had once been, rejecting every noble lady presented to him, convinced that genuine connection was a luxury he could not afford to trust. He marveled, on quiet evenings spent in the library with Eleanor beside him and their children's laughter drifting through the halls, at how thoroughly his life had transformed since the day his grandmother had insisted, against his considerable resistance, on one final introduction. "Do you ever wonder," Eleanor asked him once, many years into their marriage, as they watched Charlotte and Henry chase one another through the autumn leaves scattered across the garden, "what might have happened if your grandmother had never stopped at that chapel? If her carriage wheel had never cracked?" "Every so often," Edmund admitted, drawing her close against the cool evening air. "But I have come to believe that some things find their way to happening, regardless of circumstance. If not that afternoon, then perhaps another. I do not believe I was meant to spend my life alone, however convinced I once was of the opposite." "Your grandmother would say it was simply good sense on her part," Eleanor said, laughing softly. "My grandmother would say a great many things," Edmund replied, smiling as he watched the Duchess herself approaching slowly across the lawn, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the chill, her face lit with quiet contentment as she called out to her great-grandchildren, urging them not to catch a chill in the fading afternoon light. The Duke, who had once rejected every noble lady presented to him, had, in the end, found something far more valuable than a suitable match arranged through careful calculation. He had found a partner who challenged him, who understood him, who had weathered genuine hardship alongside him, and emerged only stronger for it. And in the quiet, contented rhythm of family life at Ashworth Hall, surrounded by the people who had transformed a house of grief into a true and lasting home, Edmund Ashworth understood, more fully with each passing year, that his grandmother had been right about one thing above all else. Some women were, indeed, entirely extraordinary, and worth every ounce of patience it took to finally recognize them.